it goes back to this one little word, remember. And it's so phenomenal because one of the things that I have been realizing is that when you study scripture, the place over and over, people lose faith. They go from being in faith to unbelief when they forget what God has done for them and when they forget what God has done for other people. And when they forget what God did for their families and their ancestors. And every time people slipped into unbelief, it was because they forgot. It's so important to remind ourselves of what God's done in our life already. Faith is just defying natural circumstances, natural laws, by using God's laws, by walking in God's ways. If you want to see breakthrough in your finances, you need to remember what God's done. The power to get wealth. Why would a Christian name a channel The Power to Get Wealth? Well, I took it straight out of Scripture, Deuteronomy 8:18. That's a verse that says, remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant that he swore with your forefathers as it is to this day. There was just a season in my life where God just began to challenge me that the power to get wealth was no different than the power learning how to fish, the power of learning how to hunt, that we so often want to give people things, but really we empower them when we teach them how to do things. And I love the comparison for me was always the analogy of the I think it's a Chinese proverb that says, give a man a fish, feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, feed him for a lifetime. And I'm not a fisherman or a fisherwoman, but I do know how to hunt. I grew up big game hunting with my dad in northern Canada. And I know that I have the ability to feed my family by hunting game. If push came to shove, my dad was able to put 500 pounds of meat every year on our family's table. In fact, if you hear more of my stories, you'll discover we grew up butchering a moose or an elk, sometimes both, every fall on our kitchen table in our house. And we processed and packed 500 pounds of meat, made it into hamburgers and stew meat and roasts. And so that's a visceral metaphor for me. That is something I can really see, I can feel, I can touch in a sense. And so this channel is about learning how wealth works. What's the language of wealth? Most of us, many people have grown up in poverty or nothing more than the middle class, and you don't even know that you are inculcated with, indoctrinated almost, it's a weird way to think of it, but whatever worldview you're in, you don't even know there's another worldview until you move beyond it. It's like living in America. You don't even know there's another world until you step outside of America or see the world from a different lens in a different, going to China, going to Europe, going to South America. And you, if you live in those countries, if you live in Brazil or you live in Germany or you live in Southeast Asia and Vietnam or Thailand, you don't know what the world of America is like until you set foot in America. And so we have these worldviews, and you can hear them, you can watch them on videos, but it's a very different thing to walk and talk and actually put your foot on the ground of that place and talk to people in real life, in real time. It's a powerful thing to have video, and it can transport us mentally, and that's the beginning of going places, and you have to go there in your mind often before you go there with your feet. The point being, the power to get wealth. The key of this verse, though, is it says, remember the Lord your God. And this is something, man, I have been digging into the last few weeks. It seems like it's coming at me from every different way, that when you are moving forward in faith, especially in any area, financially, relationally, in your health, and you're believing God for miracles, you're believing God for increase, you're believing God to take ground, whatever that promised land is that God has shown you, that living without disease, living maybe in relationships, maybe it's getting married, maybe it's having children, maybe it's financially being able to go into business, having freedom, not working, not slaving 9 to 5 or 80 hours a week in a corporate job, but getting to use your gifts and talents and being creative in the ways that God's made you. And how do we get there? What's the beginning of the power to get wealth? It goes back to this one little word, remember. And it's so phenomenal because one of the things that I have been realizing is that when you study scripture, the place over and over, people lose faith. They go from being in faith to unbelief when they forget what God has done for them and when they forget what God has done for other people. And when they forget what God did for their families and their ancestors. And every time people slipped into unbelief, it was because they forgot. Over and over and over. My husband and I were reading through the book of Judges right now, and it seems like they'd have this miracle and Israel would remember, and they'd have like 40 years of peace, and then they would forget, and they would enter into unbelief, and they would enter into depravity, and then someone else would be raised up as a deliverer, and they would get freedom, and they would fight off the bad guys, and they would get another 40 years of peace, and then it was just this roller coaster throughout Judges. And if you look at what that roller coaster really is, it's like remembering, forgetting, remembering, forgetting, remembering, forgetting. And so it's so important to remind ourselves of what God's done in our life already. And if you don't have stories of what God's done, if you have no memory of how God's moved in your life, then you need to study this Bible, and you need to remember what God did for the children of Israel. You need to remember what Jesus did over and over, the stories throughout the New Testament. We can get around people, even watching videos and sharing videos, stories of how God has broke through and the miracles he's done in other people's lives. And this is why, because there's a verse in Revelation, I don't know the exact scripture, but it says the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. So every time we testify of what God's doing in our life, has done in our life, has done in someone else's life, or has done throughout the Bible, we are prophesying to someone else. We're encouraging them that God can do it again. God will do it again for them. The testimony of Jesus. What's a testimony? It's something you're not just thinking about, but you're actually speaking out loud. So it's really good to remember here, but it's even more powerful when you speak it out, when you actually testify and you speak with your own words what the facts are, what the truth is. I like to delineate between the facts of the situation might be what the reality of what my perception is of my situation, but the truth is what God says about my situation. The truth is God's perspective on my situation. And so that's one of the way I use these words, truth and facts, to help me live in the tension of just because I'm experiencing something doesn't mean that's the only way it can be interpreted. And even though that's my reality, that's not God's reality. There's a reality that trumps that always supersedes whatever's happening in my life. Kind of like the law of gravity and the law of aerodynamics. The law of aerodynamics always trumps the law of gravity. You're stuck on this ground and you're not going anywhere. And if you jump off a cliff, you are going to fall to your death unless you employ certain principles. And if you employ the principles of the law of aerodynamics, thrust, wings, maybe fuel for that thrust, whatever it is, the law of aerodynamics is going to give you a totally different experience, and you're going to defy gravity. And that's really what faith is all the time. Faith is just defying natural circumstances, natural laws, by using God's laws, by walking in God's ways. And so my challenge to you is to remember what God has done in your life. And if you don't have a memory of it, go find stories of what God's done for other people and remember those and focus on them and hang on to them and talk about those, or talk about the stories in the Bible. Talk about the people that Jesus changed their life. Talk about those stories to people, but testify of it. Speak with your own mouth to yourself. Stand in front of the mirror if you have to. When you're walking down the street, I can't tell you how many times when I go walking and praying, half of my time is not even praying to the Lord. It is just It's speaking scripture over my life. It's reminding me of what God's done. I'll talk to myself about the miracles that God has done in my life, the things that, if I could make a list of how God has intervened and the answers to prayers that I've seen, I want to bring those back to my mind so that I can trust God in these other areas that I'm contending for and I'm believing big things for. And so this is the thing that I am knee deep in. If you want to see breakthrough in your finances, if you want to see a breakthrough when it comes to money, resources, business, you need to remember what God's done and you need to speak about it so that you hear with your own ears, never mind anyone else. And every time you're testifying of what God has done for someone else in the Bible or in your own life, you are going to be prophesying it into your own future and speaking into your own future, speaking words of life and creative power over your own life for God to move in that situation. So thank you so much for joining me. I am so excited for the things on the horizon to share, and just love technology, love this opportunity to be able to just share with you. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for joining me. Please subscribe if you haven't, and share the video with someone that needs to hear this today. Appreciate you.